It was late in the afternoon when the call came through, a frantic, rushed voice telling me that my son, Eric, had been in an accident. I didn't wait to hear the rest of the details. I grabbed my coat, slid into my boots, and drove straight to the hospital. The roads were treacherous, a layer of frost coating the asphalt, the sky gray and heavy with snow. I imagined the conditions that might have caused his accident, a pang of guilt and fear tightening in my chest. When I reached the hospital, my heart was pounding. My 21-year-old son was no longer a child, but the instinct to protect him, to shield him from harm, was still as strong as the day he was born. Mrs. Harper. A nurse approached me in the waiting room, her face kind but professional. Eric is stable. He suffered a concussion and a few bruised ribs, but nothing life-threatening. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding, relief washing over me. When I finally saw him, lying there with a bandage over his forehead and his arm resting in a sling, my chest tightened again. He looked so young, so vulnerable. For all his bravado and newfound independence, here he was, still my boy. "Hey, Mom." His voice was raspy, his smile crooked. "I'm fine, really." I wanted to scold him, to remind him to be more careful, but all I could do was hold his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "You scared me," I said, my voice trembling. For the next few days, I stayed by his side as he recovered. The snowstorm outside only worsened, blanketing our town in white. We were trapped in the house together, just the two of us. It felt almost nostalgic, a rare pause in our busy lives. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Eric opened up in a way I hadn't expected. "You know, Mom, when the car skidded and I realized I was going to crash, all I could think about was you." I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Me?" He nodded. I kept thinking about how you'd feel if I didn't make it. And it made me realize how much I take you for granted." Tears pricked at my eyes. "Eric, you're my world. But you don't have to carry that guilt. Just promise me you'll be more careful." He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I will, Mom. I promise." That night I lay awake, thinking about how fleeting life could be. The accident had shaken both of us, forcing us to confront feelings we rarely voiced. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, unspoken bond that had always been there, just beneath the surface. Over the following days, our conversations grew deeper. We laughed about old memories, like the time he'd gotten his head stuck in the banister as a child, or the ridiculous Halloween costume I'd made him wear when he was 5. But there were also quieter moments, where he'd thank me for sacrifices I'd made, for being there when he needed me most. The snow eventually began to melt, and life started to return to normal. Eric was cleared to drive again, and I reluctantly handed him back the keys to his car, though not without a long list of motherly reminders. No speeding, no texting, and if the roads look even slightly icy. "Mom," he interrupted, his grin wide. "Get it. I'll be careful." I watched him drive away, the ache of letting go as strong as ever, but I knew I had to trust him. The accident had been a wake-up call, not just about the fragility of life, but about the importance of the bond we shared. As I turned back toward the house, I felt a sense of gratitude. It wasn't often that life gave us a second chance to appreciate what truly mattered. And for that I was endlessly thankful. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The twinkling lights, the soft carols playing in the background, the warm glow of the fireplace. It all held a certain magic. But this year it felt different. After Eric's accident, I found myself hesitant to dive into the usual traditions. The house had been quieter since that day, as though the lingering fear had muted our usual joy. That's when Eric surprised me. "Mom," he said one afternoon, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, a boyish grin on his face. "We need to bring Christmas back to this house. I've got it all planned out. Decorations, lights, the tree. Everything." I raised an eyebrow. "You've got it planned out, huh? Do I get a say?" He shrugged, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Oh, consider it my apology for scaring you half to death last month." The next morning, He woke me up earlier than I'd intended with a steaming cup of coffee and a list. We're hitting the store for lights and ornaments, then picking out a tree. I figured we could make a day of it. I couldn't remember the last time Eric had been so eager to spend an entire day with me. Usually, his schedule with college or friends kept him busy. My heart warmed at the thought of us sharing this tradition again, just like when he was younger. At the store, Eric meticulously examined every strand of lights and every ornament as if choosing them were a life-or-death decision. "Eric, they're just lights," I teased, watching him hold up 2 identical strands of twinkling white bulbs. He looked at me with mock seriousness. "Oh, Mom, these are warm white and these are cool white. They set entirely different moods." I laughed, shaking my head. "Whatever you pick will be perfect." Back at home, the real fun began. Eric carried the tree in himself, ignoring my protests about his injured ribs. "I've got it, Mom," he insisted, wincing only slightly as he maneuvered the enormous pine into the living room. Decorating the tree became a trip down memory lane. As I unwrapped the ornaments, I'd find ones he'd made in elementary school, little handprints turned into reindeer or stars he'd painted with glitter. "Remember this one?" I asked, holding up a particularly lopsided ornament. "You made this in 2nd grade." Eric groaned, his face flushing. "Ugh, how did that thing survive this long?" "It's hideous." I smiled, hanging it front and center. "It's perfect." The more we worked, the more the house began to transform. Eric strung lights around the windows, draped garlands over the mantel, and even climbed up on the roof to hang icicle lights, despite my protests. "Eric Harper, you get down from there right now," I shouted, my voice rising with worry. He peeked over the edge of the roof, grinning. "Relax, Mom. I'm being careful. No more accidents, I promise." Still, I didn't take my eyes off him until he was safely back on the ground. That evening, as we stood outside admiring the glowing house, I couldn't help but feel my heart swell with pride. "You've outdone yourself," I said, nudging him gently. "It's not about the lights, Mom," he replied, his voice soft. "It's about making it feel like home again." In the days leading up to Christmas, Eric took it upon himself to help around the house in ways that went beyond decorating. He shoveled the driveway before I could even grab my coat, cleaned out the garage, and even offered to cook dinner a few nights. "I could get used to this," I joked one evening as he served up a surprisingly decent lasagna. "Don't get too used to it," he shot back with a grin. "College starts back up soon, and I'll be out of here before you know it." His words were a stark reminder that these moments, as special as they were, wouldn't last forever. Christmas Eve arrived, and Eric insisted on staying up late to finish wrapping presents. I found him in the living room, surrounded by rolls of wrapping paper and tangled ribbons. "Need help?" I asked, sitting beside him. He shook his head but smiled. "We've got it. You've done enough for me already. It's my turn to do something for you." His words brought tears to my eyes. "You're my son, Eric. It's never been about doing things for me, it's about being here. That's all I've ever wanted." For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached out, taking my hand. "Thanks, Mom. For everything." That night, as the snow fell softly outside and the tree glowed warmly in the corner, I felt a peace I hadn't in months. Eric's accident had been a terrifying reminder of how fragile life could be, but it had also brought us closer. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but think that this Christmas, more than any other, was one I'd treasure forever. It wasn't the lights or the decorations that made it special. It was Eric, his kindness, his thoughtfulness, and the way he reminded me what the season was really about. Love, family, and second chances. Christmas morning dawned with a soft blanket of snow covering the neighborhood, the sunlight bouncing off the white expanse in golden hues. The house was warm and glowing, filled with the soft hum of holiday music and the scents of cinnamon and pine. For the first time in years, everything felt perfect. Eric was already up when I came downstairs, dressed in a cozy sweater and tending to something on the stove. The sight of him standing there, humming along to a carol, filled me with a deep, maternal pride. "Morning, Mom," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. Coffee's ready. I poured myself a cup, sitting at the kitchen table and watching him as he worked. You're becoming quite the chef lately, I teased. He grinned. Don't get used to it. I'm just trying to spoil you a little while I can. After breakfast, we settled by the Christmas tree to exchange gifts. I handed him the package I'd carefully wrapped the night before, a set of leather-bound journals, knowing how much he loved writing. His face lit up as he opened it. Mom, these are amazing, he said, flipping through the pages. Thank you. Then he handed me a small box, wrapped in red paper with a golden ribbon. This one's for you. I unwrapped it slowly, my heart fluttering with anticipation. Inside was a delicate golden heart-shaped pendant, the surface smooth and polished to a mirror-like shine. I held it up, the light catching it just right, making it gleam like a star. Eric, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's beautiful. He leaned forward, taking the pendant from my hands. Here, let me put it on you. I turned, brushing my hair aside as he fastened the chain around my neck. His fingers were gentle, and the pendant settled just above my heart, its weight comforting. You've always been my heart, Mom, he said softly. His voice filled with emotion. I just wanted you to have something to remind you of that. Tears filled my eyes as I turned back to him. Before I could say anything, he pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and warm around me. He kissed my hands, a gesture so tender it left me speechless. You mean the world to me, he said. I don't say it enough, but I hope you know. I held him tighter, my tears spilling over. You don't have to say it, Eric. I feel it every day. Later that afternoon, Eric decided to make mulled wine, something neither of us had tried before. He insisted on doing it himself, claiming he had seen a recipe online that looked foolproof. The kitchen filled with the rich, spicy aroma of cloves, cinnamon, and orange as he carefully measured and stirred. I sat at the counter, watching him with a mixture of amusement and admiration. Who are you, and what have you done with my son? I teased as he sprinkled nutmeg into the pot. He laughed. I figured I'd give you a Christmas to remember. How am I doing so far? Better than I could have imagined, I said honestly. When the mulled wine was ready, he poured us each a mug, garnishing them with a slice of orange and a cinnamon stick. We carried them into the living room, settling by the fire as snow continued to fall outside. The warmth of the wine spread through me as I took a sip, its sweetness and spice perfectly balanced. This is amazing, Eric, I said. You might have a future in winemaking. He chuckled, taking a sip of his own. I think I'll stick to college for now, but I'll keep that in mind. As the evening wore on, our conversation drifted from light-hearted banter to more meaningful reflections. Eric opened up about how the accident had changed him, how it had made him realize what truly mattered. I was so focused on school and friends and everything else, he admitted, staring into the fire. I didn't realize how much I'd been taking you for granted. That accident. It scared me, Mom. I don't ever want to lose you. I reached over, placing my hand on his. You're not going to lose me. And you don't have to feel guilty for living your life. That's what I want for you. To be happy, to be free. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. I'm happy, Mom. Because of you. You've always been there for me no matter what. And I want to be there for you too. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I felt something shift between us. Our relationship had always been close, but now it felt even deeper, more grounded in mutual understanding and love. In that quiet moment I realized how much Eric had grown, not just physically but emotionally. He was no longer the boy I had raised, but a man who understood the value of family, of connection. When it was time for bed, I touched the pendant at my throat, feeling its cool surface against my skin. It was a reminder of this day, of the bond we shared and the love that would always tie us together. As I climbed into bed, I couldn't help but smile. Christmas had always been about family, about giving and receiving love. This year, Eric had given me more than I could have ever asked for. The gift of his heart, his time, and his unwavering devotion. And in return, I gave him the one thing he needed most, My unconditional love, a love that would carry us through whatever lay ahead. The house was silent, wrapped in the gentle stillness of the snowy night. I had gone to bed hours earlier, lulled by the warmth of the firelight still flickering in the living room. The events of the day had left me with a full heart, and as I lay under the covers, I found myself absent-mindedly fingering the pendant Eric had given me, its smooth surface cool against my skin. Sleep came in fits and starts, my mind replaying the moments of the day. His laughter, his thoughtfulness, the depth of his words. It was a Christmas I would cherish forever. Somewhere in the quiet hours of the night, I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. "Mom." Eric's voice was low, hesitant. I sat up slightly, switching on the bedside lamp. "Eric, is everything okay?" The door opened just enough for him to peek in. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stepping inside. "Come here," I said, patting the edge of the bed. But instead of sitting beside me, he lowered himself onto the floor, leaning his back against the side of the bed. His knees were drawn up, his arms resting on them as he looked down at his hands. "What's on your mind?" I asked softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. He hesitated, the silence stretching between us. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he finally said. I blinked, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" Eric glanced over his shoulder at me, his eyes searching mine. "You've always been my everything, Mom. You've always taken care of me, supported me, loved me unconditionally." He stopped, shaking his head as if frustrated with his inability to find the right words. "You're my son," I said gently, trying to ease whatever turmoil he was feeling. "Course I love you. That's never going to change." "I know," he said quickly. I don't think I tell you enough how much you mean to me. How much I appreciate you. I've been so selfish sometimes, caught up in my own life. I don't want to take you for granted anymore." I felt my heart ache at the vulnerability in his voice. "Eric, you're not selfish. You're growing up. It's normal to focus on your own life. But it means a lot to me to hear you say that." He nodded but didn't reply, staring down at his hands again. I reached out, running my fingers gently through his hair, a gesture that had comforted him when he was a child. "Hey," I said softly. "It's okay. You're allowed to feel things. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." He leaned into my touch slightly, his shoulders relaxing. "You always know what to say," he murmured. For a while, we sat there in comfortable silence, the only sound the faint whisper of wind outside. Then, without warning, he turned toward me. Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed my cheek, the touch lingering longer than I expected. "Good night, Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he stood and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. I sat there for a long time, my hand resting on the spot where his kiss had landed, my heart beating faster than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I wasn't sure if I believed it.